In the months following the collapse, the Aggie community struggled to redefine itself without the bonfire as its symbolic centerpiece. For generations, bonfire had been a proving ground, an ordeal that translated physical suffering into social belonging. Without it, many students felt a void not just in tradition but in identity. Incoming freshmen heard stories of bonfire not as a living ritual, but as a cautionary tale. What had once been a unifying experience now existed only in memory, frozen at the moment of collapse. This transition was not smooth. Traditions do not disappear quietly. They leave behind questions about what they meant and whether their meaning was ever worth the cost. Survivors of the collapse often described a fractured sense of time. For them, life divided into before bonfire and after bonfire. Ordinary campus sounds, the clang of metal, the crack of wood, shouted instructions, could trigger vivid flashbacks. Some survivors changed majors, transferred universities, or left college entirely. Others stayed but disengaged from campus life, retreating inward. Interviews conducted years later revealed how many carried unresolved anger. Anger at leaders who pushed them to keep working, anger at administrators who allowed the event to continue, and anger at themselves for trusting a system that failed so catastrophically. The physical injuries, while severe, were often easier to explain than the psychological ones. Broken bones healed. Scars faded. Trauma did not. Many students spoke of survivors' guilt, replaying small decisions, stepping away for a break, switching shifts, arriving late, that spared their lives while costing others theirs. These internal narratives became burdens carried silently, shaped by a culture that valued strength and stoicism. Counseling services expanded, but cultural barriers remained. To admit vulnerability felt to some like another betrayal of Aggie toughness. As legal proceedings unfolded, depositions and testimonies painted a clearer picture of how deeply ingrained risk had become. Students testified that exhaustion was routine, not exceptional. Safety equipment was sometimes unavailable, sometimes ignored, sometimes considered a nuisance. Leadership roles rewarded endurance and loyalty rather than caution. The language used to motivate workers emphasized duty, legacy, and sacrifice, words that carried emotional power but obscured practical danger. This rhetoric, repeated year after year, normalized the idea that suffering was proof of commitment. Experts reviewing the bonfire design emphasized that it lacked even the most basic structural safeguards. There were no formal load calculations, no stress testing, no contingency planning for partial failure. The structure relied on friction, gravity, and hope. It was a monument built without margins of error. In professional construction, redundancy exists because failure is assumed to be possible. At bonfire, failure was assumed to be impossible because it had never happened before. This assumption represented a critical cognitive failure known as outcome bias, judging the safety of a practice based solely on past success rather than inherent risk. Each year the bonfire stood reinforced the belief that it was safe. Each year without disaster became evidence not of luck but of correctness. This feedback loop silenced dissent and elevated tradition to the status of proof. By the time the structure reached its final form in 1999, it was no longer just unsafe. It was inevitable that it would fail. The only unknown was when. Media retrospectives years later highlighted how warnings often emerge only after tragedy reframes them. What once seemed like harmless creaking was now recognized as structural distress. What once felt like manageable sway was reinterpreted as instability. The disaster rewrote memory, forcing participants to reassess experiences they had previously dismissed. This retrospective clarity deepened grief, as survivors realized that the signs were there, unnoticed or ignored. Within higher education, the bonfire collapse became a turning point. Universities nationwide began re-evaluating student-run events involving physical risk. Policies were rewritten to require professional oversight, formal risk assessments, and clear chains of accountability. The idea that tradition alone could justify danger was increasingly challenged. In this way, the law at Texas A&M reshaped practices far beyond its campus, influencing how institutions balance autonomy with responsibility. Yet for many families, institutional reform offered little solace. Parents spoke publicly about trust placed in a university to protect students not only academically but physically. That trust, once broken, could not be restored by policy changes alone. Memorial ceremonies provided space for grief but not closure. Closure for many remained elusive because the tragedy was not random. It was constructed log by log, decision by decision. The memorial's design reflected this understanding. Unlike monuments that seek to inspire awe, the bonfire memorial invites introspection. The names are individual, not collective. The alignment with the moment of collapse ensures that time itself becomes part of the memory. Visitors often describe a sensation of stillness, as if the site resists noise or haste. It stands in deliberate contrast to the energy that once surrounded bonfire, a reminder that silence can carry meaning as powerfully as fire. As the years passed, the bonfire story began to function as moral inheritance for new generations of Aggies. Orientation programs referenced it. Engineering students studied it. Leaders invoked it when discussing safety and responsibility. In this way, the tragedy became embedded into the university's ethical framework. Not as a point of pride but as a boundary, a reminder of what must never happen again. The Aggie Bonfire Collapse endures because it resists simplification. It cannot be reduced to villain and victim, nor dismissed as bad luck. It demands sustained attention, precisely because it emerged from ordinary decisions made by well-intentioned people within a flawed system. That is what makes it unsettling. It suggests that similar tragedies are always possible wherever tradition discourages scrutiny and loyalty suppresses dissent. In the end, the bonfire did what fire itself often does. It revealed what lay beneath the surface. It exposed how deeply culture shapes behavior, how easily risk becomes invisible, and how institutions can confuse endurance with virtue. The collapse was sudden. The failure behind it was slow, cumulative, and shared. To remember the Aggie Bonfire is not to remember a rivalry or celebration. It is to remember a warning. One written not in flames but in silence, stone, and absence. As rescue operations transitioned fully into recovery, a heavy stillness settled over the bonfire site. Heavy machinery replaced frantic hands, not because urgency had faded, but because reality had hardened. Each log lifted carried the possibility of discovery, and with it the emotional weight of confirmation. Rescue workers, many of them Aggie alumni themselves, described the process as methodical but devastating. Silence was often enforced not as a formality but out of respect, allowing rescuers to listen for any remaining signs of life. When none came, the silence became something else entirely: acknowledgement. The physical layout of the collapse complicated recovery. Logs had fallen in interlocking patterns, compressing spaces where students had been standing or climbing moments earlier. Some victims were shielded briefly by voids, others crushed instantly. These details, later reconstructed by investigators, underscored the randomness of survival. Inches mattered. Seconds mattered. The same structure that had symbolized unity had become a lethal maze, indifferent to intention or effort. As the final victims were recovered, attention turned toward documentation. Photographs were taken. Measurements recorded. Logs were tagged and mapped. This forensic phase was crucial not only for investigation but for accountability. Structural engineers began reconstructing the bonfire digitally, layer by layer, attempting to understand how load shifted and where failure initiated. Their conclusions were consistent. The collapse began near the center, where excessive vertical loading met insufficient lateral support. Once that core failed, the rest followed almost instantaneously. Public hearings brought painful testimony. Students described being told to keep working despite visible instability. Some recalled leadership dismissing concerns as nervousness or inexperience. Others spoke of exhaustion so severe it impaired judgment, yet was treated as a badge of honor. These accounts painted a picture of a system that rewarded compliance and endurance while marginalizing caution. The bonfire was not just built from wood, it was built from expectation. University officials testified as well, emphasizing the decentralized nature of the event. They described bonfire as student-led, a phrase that quickly became controversial. Critics argued that leadership without oversight is not empowerment but abdication. The university provided land, resources, and legitimacy. In doing so, it assumed responsibility, whether explicitly acknowledged or not. This tension between formal authority and informal control became central to the broader debate about institutional duty of care. The legal dimension unfolded slowly, as such cases often do. Settlements were reached, but details remained private, fueling speculation and dissatisfaction. For some families, legal resolution felt hollow, constrained by procedural language and financial calculus. What they sought was acknowledgement, clear recognition that the deaths were not the unavoidable cost of tradition, but the consequence of preventable failure. That acknowledgement, many felt, never arrived in full. Meanwhile, the Aggie community grappled with how to remember without romanticizing. Memory is selective by nature, and there was concern that bonfire might gradually be framed as a noble sacrifice rather than a cautionary lesson. University leadership took deliberate steps to prevent this reframing. Official narratives emphasized safety, responsibility, and loss. Rivalry language was stripped away. The bonfire was no longer discussed as a symbol of defiance, but as a reminder of consequence. Anthropologists and sociologists later examined the bonfire collapse as a case study in ritual escalation. Traditions, they argued, tend to intensify over time as participants seek to outdo predecessors, reinforcing identity through increasing commitment. Without external constraints, this escalation can push rituals beyond safe limits. Bonfire exemplified this pattern. Each generation inherited not only a tradition, but the expectation to enhance it. Bigger became better. Harder became purer. Risk became invisible. This analysis reframed the collapse not as an anomaly, but as an outcome of predictable social dynamics. It challenged the comforting idea that tragedies are rare interruptions in otherwise functional systems. Instead, it suggested that systems themselves can drift toward failure when feedback mechanisms are absent. In Bonfire's case, success, year after year, masked danger, allowing risk to accumulate unnoticed. The story also resonated beyond academia. Parents across the country questioned the safety of student-run traditions at other universities. Administrators reviewed events once considered harmless. Insurance providers revised coverage requirements. Quietly but decisively, the ripple effects spread. The bonfire collapse became part of a broader shift in how institutions assessed extracurricular risk, especially when tradition intersected with physical danger. For survivors, anniversaries became complex emotional markers. Each November brought renewed attention, ceremonies, and media retrospectives. Some found solace in collective remembrance. Others found it re-traumatizing. The passage of time did not dull the memory. It sharpened it as life milestones, graduation, careers, families, unfolded without those who should have been there. Absence became more pronounced, not less. The memorial ceremonies evolved into moments of education as well as remembrance. Speakers avoided spectacle. Silence played a central role. The absence of fire was intentional. Where bonfire had once been loud, chaotic, and consuming, remembrance was quiet, ordered, and restrained. This contrast was not accidental. It reflected a conscious rejection of the values that had allowed the tragedy to occur. Within Texas A&M, leadership training programs began emphasizing ethical responsibility alongside loyalty. Students were encouraged, explicitly, to speak up when something felt unsafe, even if it meant challenging tradition or authority. Whether culture fully shifted is difficult to measure, but the language changed. And language, over time, shapes behavior. The Aggie Bonfire Collapse continues to resist closure because it sits at the intersection of pride and regret. It forces an uncomfortable recognition that the same forces capable of building strong communities can also blind them. Unity can suppress dissent. Loyalty can override judgment. Tradition can become inertia. In this sense, the bonfire is not unique. It echoes other preventable tragedies, industrial accidents, crowd disasters, structural failures, where warnings existed but were ignored because stopping felt unthinkable. What distinguishes bonfire is its intimacy. It was built by students for students in the name of belonging. That intimacy magnifies its lesson. As time moves forward, the bonfire itself fades from lived memory, but the collapse does not. It persists because it asks a question that remains unresolved. How much risk is acceptable in the name of tradition? And who gets to decide? The answer, written in the quiet geometry of the memorial, is not theoretical. It is measured in names, moments, and lives interrupted. And as long as institutions continue to balance pride against responsibility, the Aggie Bonfire Collapse will remain not just a story of the past, but a warning for the future.